I do see contemporary art as an exclusively Western phenomenon and a cultural one that is limited to a very specific social and economical class. Hi, I'm Alexey Vanyushkin, and I'm the artist.
Thank you, Alexey, for being here at BASIS and taking the time to talk about your work, which we will present this month at Double Feature at Schirm. And you will show two of your recent films, The Wandering Kind from 2016 and Alphabet from 2017. Maybe before we start going into detail with the two works, I was wondering if you could just tell me, where do you actually start your research very practically? Like, where do you get your images from? Do you have an image archive or something like that?
To be quite honest, most of the time the work starts out with not exactly a vision, but a sort of an idea of how it will all look like in the very end, and a certain direction into which I'm going to go. I don't really have an archive that I maintain specifically for that purpose, and basically every work is made from the scratch, which is why it takes quite a bit of time to make each work. But despite the fact that most of the imagery comes from pretty much the same sources, it's the photographic books, the magazines, sometimes the internet, although that's a bit harder to come by with a good resolution. I try to come up with a general idea of how it will look like on the wall, for example, and then I kind of I go from that.
In Alphabet we have a text which accompanies the images, so it's probably there isn't any way to say the text was first or the image was first or something like that, right? Or is it different in Alphabet?
Well, the funny thing is that Alphabet has a very coherent text, which is essentially a poem. There was an idea since the very beginning to make it an audio-visual poem. So the images would on one hand illustrate, but on the other hand also kind of either fight or add to the meaning of the words. And then because each word is shown separately, that it has a kind of a quality to it that it's almost an advertisement presentation, almost like a slogan in each image. I was really quite simple. I just remembered Sesame Street for some reason one day, and I recall that in the Sesame Street there was always this segment that is trying to teach children, for example, how to count. So I think there was this Count Dracula character who would kind of make this kind of movements, and then it's like 1, 2, and then the image would appear. And then I thought like that perhaps it would be an interesting thing to make such a video that essentially does the same function as Sesame Street, to attempt to teach the children in some way, but the things that would be taught would be rather terminology and ideas and visual or textual, the ones that adults deal with on an everyday basis, but they don't necessarily teach you in school about those things. And some kind of abstract ideas that maybe have to do both with politics and both with the relationships among adults. And of course, the terminology is obviously related to the modern day problems or modern day issues.
It's a mix of imagery, but there was one very striking image or sequence where you juxtaposed the image of the lynch murder of William Brown with the word knowledge. And I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about well, maybe this specific sequence, but also about the idea of incorporating images that are, well, rooted in our cultural memory in a way.
I've been trying to use both the footage and the imagery, and perhaps also the linguistical kind of style that is not in any way new and not in any way artistic, but attempt to use these things that people are already know and things that people kind of encounter on an everyday basis, either on their phones in the newsfeed or, I don't know, on television or in newspapers, so things that people don't really think of as art. And so in that sense, the imagery would actually be transparent. People would think about it rather more as an element of their everyday life than something that is specifically framed for them and be put on the wall to pay attention to. And this specific image, of course, it has a slight edge of provocation, but I don't really think that it would be out of place after 2016 to say that this specific image is actually not a part of common cultural knowledge at all. It is something that we perhaps know about, but we don't really know what that looked like, because this sort of imagery is not really something that people would see either in school or, you know, they wouldn't really probably seek it out on purpose.
Well, in Wandering Kind we also have a sequence of images, text, music, but you also introduced a character, sort of. It's a cartoon drawing of a penis which walks through the images, through different places, different times. Can you tell me a bit more about this character, why you introduced it, or if it stands for anything or anyone?
At some point, as a white male artist, I realized that there's a certain discrepancy between the demographics of the artists and the topics about which they attempt to talk in their work. And so for me it seemed important at a certain point to try and find a certain foundation from which I can build the conversation with the viewer, and for that reason I would need to find out what is exactly my position. And the animated white penis walking around, all sorts of imagery and all sorts of information would be a stand-in both for me as the author, because I'm representative of the demographic, and it's also representative of the audience, because I do see contemporary art as an exclusively Western phenomenon and a cultural one that is limited to a very specific social and economical class. And I do think that regardless of the gender, this is a stand-in for both the people who produce and people who consume that sort of art. It also seemed like a great thing to use because on the one hand it's an incredibly dumb joke, and I personally didn't really find it funny, although I did attempt to make at least a few sequences that would be funny for people. Most of the video art that has been produced, perhaps until the middle of the 90s, has been going in a very different direction, away from entertainment, and I personally think that there really isn't any reason to deny that part of the experience to the viewers. I think it could be part of the work, and if it's used to make sure that the viewers stay in front of the video, then I might as well use that. And the other thing is, I didn't really think that this is funny in any way. When I made it, I thought like, this kind of looks slightly sentimental, and I'm not sure that anybody would ever find it funny. At the same time, I found myself quite a few times in a situation where I've seen the viewers react to that, and I've seen them laughing at moments that I actually thought are the saddest or the most difficult ones. So it's difficult to say whether my intentions even play a role in the interpretation of the work anymore.
So would you say, or would you agree that there's a certain interplay between the symbol of masculinity and the images you chose?
Yes, I do think that somehow, strangely enough, for instance, Barnett Newman and a bunch of other superstars, especially American artists, did indulge into making somewhat phallic art, but I don't think that they did it consciously. It was just important for me to say that in this situation nothing is kind of untouched or nothing is sacred. So we can expand this conversation from pointing. It's not just some silly politicians, but it's actually everything. It's part of this Western kind of culture.
Maybe you can tell us a bit more about this also slightly pessimistic overtone maybe of the two works. Does it relate to anything specific?
Those specific moods that might be present in the work that could be seen as pessimistic are for me more of a tool to make sure that people have a reaction to the work, because to me that reaction has to be a mix between the emotional and the intellectual one, as you have to have a feeling that you are obliged to think about it, that you are obliged to kind of consider what has been shown to you. And one of those tools is essentially making the viewer uncomfortable.